So, my friend, the legend of Ichabod Crane lives on in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Today, Showcase Salem comes to you from Tarrytown, New York. Sleepy Hollow!
We're going to be going on a tour at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. We are the Rip Van Winkle group. Come with us.
Alright, I think we got everyone back with us, and let's keep on walking. Alright, now ladies, I gotta tell you something about cemeteries and women. There are a lot of women in cemeteries, usually as figures of mourning. Those of you who are looking at this one right here behind me, you know, Drew Barrymore. I mean, someone looks very much like Drew Barrymore there. Just no relation to Mr. Lister, whose monument it is, but just a female figure in a pose of mourning. I'm going to shine my light over across everyone's heads here and light up another one over here. Another female figure.
Oh, look at that.
Wow. Well.
Yeah.
Don't worry, ladies, we got a couple of guys out there marking stuff as well. They don't mark. We're starting to head, by the way, we started in the middle of the cemetery. As we walk further down this way, we're heading sort of back in time. We're in the Victorian era right now, so the monuments are, you see some of those over-the-top mourning statues like that. This one here. Mr. Lister here, by the way, owned a fertilizer factory in Newark, New Jersey. And in the 1800s, a fertilizer factory basically consisted of, well, he took the refuse from local slaughterhouses and turned them into glue and fertilizer and other products. He actually owned a button factory here in Sleepy Hollow, down on our stream. There's still the remains of his old water-powered factory where he turned some of those bones of those slaughterhouse animals into buttons, of all things. Edwin Lister, Fertilizer King. All right. Well, we're almost to the point where we're going to start getting into the good parts of the cemetery. But these are some fairly elaborate monuments for this time, but fairly common in this part of the cemetery. You'll see more as we. Whoa! Oh my! Everyone's got torches and pitchforks. I'm getting nervous here. Don't get nervous. We're not going into this particular one, but I do have something that may pique someone's interest. But not for this particular one. All right, now that I have everybody in rapt attention around me here, welcome to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery again, and welcome to the village of Sleepy Hollow. I know some of you, for once it's not me, no worries, but that's a good reminder for me to turn mine off, because mine's usually the one that goes off with something else. I know some of you are from the area, so you're familiar with the history of the area. Let me introduce the rest of you to the background of the area and how we got started. The first European colonists in this part of the New World were the Dutch. This was part and parcel owned by the Dutch West India Company. They owned basically from New York City up to Albany and parts east and west from there. Into this particular area, this particular part of the Dutch colony was owned by a guy named Frederick Phillips. He came to the New World here in 1653 as a carpenter for the Dutch West India Company. Phillips, through his political skills, through his shrewd business sense, and because he married two wealthy widows, was able to amass a very vast estate of about 52,000 acres. It stretched from Yonkers in the south, down south here, to Croton in the north, and then east to the Bronx River. So big tract of land. He did okay for himself. When the British came into the area and wanted this colony and seized it from the Dutch, Phillips, being the shrewd politician that he was, immediately changed his allegiance to the British crown, retained his 52,000 acre estate, and life went on as usual. His heirs were not quite so astute, and during the American Revolution, the Phillips heirs sided with the British. They lost everything after the war. But it's Mr. Phillips who really concerns us, because Frederick Phillips himself, because he builds a little commercial center in this area that becomes the foundation for Washington Irving's short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I'm guessing is why most of you are here. So Phillips, on his 52,000 acre estate, had two commercial centers, one down in Yonkers and one up here in what today is Sleepy Hollow. He built a mill here, a mill pond, and a grist mill next to it. He built a trading center and a dock from where you could send ships out far and wide from here. And then, of course, he had tenant farmers growing grain and other products here on this part of the estate. In order to serve the spiritual needs of those tenant farmers and the slaves in his little colony, he built a church, the old Dutch Church of Sleepy Hollow, which is our neighbor. Some of you passed it on the way in. Not affiliated with us. The church and its 3-acre churchyard is still owned by the congregation. They're not part of us. But that church and the mill pond become the center of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, immediately after the American Revolution, when the Phillips estate is divvied up and sold off, a family named Beekman, who were American rebels, purchased the downtown area that would become today's Sleepy Hollow. So the old Phillips Manor estate became known as Beekmantown. In 1874, the hamlet of Beekmantown incorporated as the village of North Tarrytown. By 1997, the village of North Tarrytown got sick and tired of being confused with its larger neighbor Tarrytown to the south, so they changed their name to Sleepy Hollow, and that's when they sort of got themselves put on the map really well. Washington Irving actually put the village on the map 200 years ago. In 1819, Washington Irving wrote a short story called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, sets it in the little valley of the Pocantico River, through the stream. There you go. In The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the name Sleepy Hollow is not applied to the municipality that we have here today, but to the valley of the little stream that runs down behind us. So you're actually standing in the real Sleepy Hollow. It's this little secluded valley, which, fortunately, doesn't have a housing development on it. It's largely preserved due to the Rockefellers, who own an estate upstream, and us here in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Now, in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it takes place immediately after the American Revolution. Dutch is still the predominant language. Again, this was a Dutch colony before the English came in and swiped it from the Dutch. Into this little Dutch colony comes an Englishman, a tall, gangly school teacher named Ichabod Crane, who comes down from the great state of Connecticut. Ichabod Crane doesn't just show up in town to teach the local school children. He shows up with a whole bunch of psychological baggage that will be his undoing. Ichabod Crane, as he comes to the village, sets up shop at the one-room schoolhouse, sets about teaching the local school children. He gets to know the community gets to know him, and they figure out quickly that he's a bundle of nerves. He's scared of anything and everything that goes bump in the night. Ichabod is petrified of witchcraft and goblins and anything supernatural that might appear in the night. He shows up with a great big book about witchcraft under his arm. So he's really petrified by some of the Dutch folklore and legends that he hears during his stay here in Sleepy Hollow. As he goes about teaching the local school children, he takes an interest in one of their older sisters, the lovely Katrina Van Tassel, who is the daughter of the wealthiest Dutch farmer in town. Now, Katrina's not only lovely, she also happens to have another boyfriend, who doesn't take kindly to this gangly school teacher coming in and stepping on his toes. Now, the other boyfriend's name is Brom Bones. He's a very tall, robust, and strong Dutch farm boy. If he wanted to, he could take this little English schoolmaster and snap him in two and cast him aside. But give him credit, Brom Bones has a little more going for him than Ichabod gives him credit for. As Ichabod gets into the community and starts settling in, he gets invited to community events. He gets invited to weddings, funerals, the whole 9 yards. As the seasons progress and the fall season approaches, Ichabod, like the rest of the town, looks forward to the big festival of the year, which is held at the Van Tassel homestead. As the wealthiest farmer in town, Katrina Van Tassel's father throws the best party. Ichabod, of course, shows up on the appointed day with everyone else, and of course, Brom Bones shows up, the other boyfriend of Katrina Van Tassel. And as everyone sets about filling their tummies full of pies, cakes, and other treats, Ichabod does the same, and he loves to eat, so he appreciates the good spread. As he fills his tummy full of pie cake and the rum punch, of course, Brom Bones sets about filling Ichabod's head full of tales of terror. Of course, across the course of the evening, Brom Bones really gets Ichabod revved up with tales of all the supernatural events that happen in the area, and in particular, one headless horseman who is supposedly the chief haunt of the area and the most frightening of all. The headless horseman, as Brom tells Ichabod, is the ghost of a Hessian soldier. Now, the Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British to fight the Americans during the American Revolution. Brom tells Ichabod this is one Hessian trooper who did not make it back home. He loses his head during some battle to an American cannonball, and he's surreptitiously buried in the local churchyard. Every night, says Brom, the horseman rises up from his grave, saddles up his horse, and goes riding out through Sleepy Hollow, the little valley behind us here, looking for his head. Brom doesn't quite explain how he looks for his head when the head is the one with the eyes, but, you know, it's a story, and he's getting Ichabod worked up, and Ichabod's not paying any attention to that part either. That's where the pumpkin comes in. As the fire dies down and Ichabod's anxiety really goes through the roof, Brom lays it on really thick about the headless horseman. He says, Ichabod, this creature, we've all seen it, we've all heard it, we hear it clattering up and down the highways and byways after dark, we hear it rushing by as swift as wings on the wind in the middle of the night. Brom says, I've even encountered this thing face to face, as it were. Brom says, I encountered this creature out on the old post road right out front of the Van Tassel homestead here. I challenged the guy to a race. He fancies himself a great horseman. Brom says, I'm a pretty good horseman. I challenged the horseman to a race down the post road to the church. Brom says, I won. I beat the horseman fair and square into the churchyard, but rather than living up to his end of the wager, as soon as his horse's hooves hit the bridge, the horseman vanished in a puff of smoke and a pillar of fire, and that was the last I saw of him. There we go. He's resurfacing now. As the party breaks up and everyone heads out into the night, Ichabod's thinking, well, this isn't good. I just heard about all these ghost stories. And I've got this long ride home through the dark valley, and, bad things happen in the night. And he isn't disappointed. He doesn't get more than a half a mile outside the Van Tassel's dooryard when he sees, up on the hillside, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, the figure of a very large horse, and atop it, a very large horseman. Now, there's something misshapen about this horseman. He's missing, well, his head. This isn't really sitting very well with Ichabod. He figures, I just heard about this horseman, and here he is, apparently looking for me. Ichabod hails the horseman to see if it's friend or foe. He gets no response. He's headless. What do you expect? Ichabod figures, well, maybe the horseman didn't hear me, maybe he didn't see me, maybe I'll just prance on by, and I'll go on my way, and he'll leave me alone. Unfortunately, that's not how it happens for Ichabod. As soon as Ichabod passes the horseman steps down the hill, into the road, and rides alongside Ichabod. Ichabod figures, well, I'll just, speed up my horse, maybe I'll outpace him, and I'll go my merry way. Nothing doing. The horseman picks up the pace, stays right alongside Ichabod, like Velcro. Ichabod figures, well, I'll just slow down. Maybe the horseman will overshoot me, and, I'll take another route home. Nothing doing. The horseman slows down, keeps pace with Ichabod. Ichabod figures, this isn't my night. The only thing you can think of is the ending of Brom Bones' story, where when Brom's horse hits the bridge, the horseman doesn't cross it. Instead, he vanishes. Ichabod thinks, well, if I can just make it to that bridge into the churchyard, I'll be safe. He drives the heels of his boots into the rib cage of that old broken-down plow horse that he's riding, and give her credit, as fast as she could go, she went galloping up the post road and pell-mell down the hill into the churchyard. Ichabod, in fact, is surprised at his horse's sudden vigor. He's surprised at himself that they actually make it to the churchyard before this apparently much larger and faster horse. And as his horse clatters over the bridge into the churchyard, he figures it's my lucky day. He looks over his shoulder to confirm that this horseman's going to vanish in a puff of smoke and pillar of fire like Brom Bones describes. But instead, he sees the horseman rearing up, about to throw his head. Ichabod is never seen again. He doesn't show up the next day at the farmstead where he had been bunking. He doesn't show up for church. He doesn't show up to teach the school children anymore. No Ichabod. They send out a search party the next day. They find his saddle in the dust beside the bridge. They find a smashed pumpkin next to it. They find the old horse in the farmer's pasture from whom he had borrowed it. No Ichabod. Shortly after that, though, through pure coincidence, Brom Bones happens to lead the lovely Katrina Van Tassel down the altar to wedded bliss, and ever after, whenever anyone mentions the name Ichabod Crane in the presence of Brom Bones, he gives that person a very big old wink. So that's how they deal with interlopers in Sleepy Hollow during the day. Anyway, we're much more friendly to our guests these days, so we hope you'll enjoy the rest of the walk here. We are actually around the corner from the grave of Washington Irving, who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, so let's go pay him a visit. Don't worry, we'll get into one of these things sooner or later. All right, tough for me to keep the flashlight trained on it behind my back, so forgive me for... Yeah, would you mind? That'd be great. Excellent, thanks so much. All right, this is the grave of Washington Irving. Irving, of course, wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He wrote a number of other works. He was, in fact, America's first writer to make his living solely by his own writing, by his own pen. Up until Irving's time, all of our writers had day jobs. Ben Franklin was a printer, and others had full-time gigs that paid their bills. Irving made his living only from the proceeds of his fiction and non-fiction writing. He tasted success as a young man. He wrote a mock-epic history of New York City, Dietrich Knickerbocker's history of the Dutch colony. He would write under pseudonyms quite frequently. He was born and raised in New York City, a fairly local boy. He would go on to write his first collection of stories to gain real recognition was the one that included The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that was first published in Great Britain, then released in the States the following year. He would go on at his middle age to travel, he would, as a young man, travel throughout Europe. He would go on in his middle age to return to the States, travel throughout the American West, write travelogues about the American West. He would go on to write two massive biographies in his later years, one of George Washington, one of Christopher Columbus. He was America's first world-famous author, not just the first one to make his living only by his pen. So he did okay for himself. In his later years, he bought a house locally. He spent his last few years in the village of Tarrytown, just to the south, one of the Dutch farmer's house, enlarged and expanded it, and he himself did not have children, but he invited his siblings, some of his siblings and their children to reside with him in his later years. So he had a house full of company in his declining years. Irving was instrumental in the founding of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. He not only named the area, but he was instrumental in the founding of this particular institution. Now, Irving, as you'll note, he's buried facing kind of downhill here. What he's facing in death is actually the setting of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Immediately behind you is the 3-acre churchyard of the local Dutch Reformed Church. It's from that 3-acre burying ground that the headless horseman ostensibly rises every night looking for his head. The old churchyard is only 3 acres though, and by the mid-1800s it was becoming apparent that the place was filling up pretty fast. Some local businessmen in the 1840s, some local businessmen approached Mr. Irving about establishing a larger municipal cemetery, well not municipal, but a larger non-denominational cemetery, and he was all for it. Not only was the old Dutch Reformed churchyard filling up, but Irving himself was not Dutch Reformed, he was Episcopalian, so he thought it was a great idea that you'd have a cemetery for everyone to be buried in, not just the local Dutch Reformed congregation. So Irving lent his name to our early marketing efforts. He would be horrified, though, when he found out what our name was. We were not originally the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. We were originally the Rural Cemetery at Tarrytown. I'm guessing you wouldn't be here any more than I would be if we were still the Rural Cemetery at Tarrytown. It just doesn't have that cachet to it that the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery has. So he protested mightily to our board of directors. We ignored him. He wrote letters to the editor of national magazines, and we ignored those. It wasn't until about 6 years after his death that we realized, he was right. We really should rename this place the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and sure enough, it became a lot easier to be identified as the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. So we presume he's rested in peace, a lot more peacefully anyway, ever since we renamed ourselves. Irving, as you note from the flags on either side of him, he is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. He served as a military secretary for the governor of New York State during the War of 1812. It was during the War of 1812 that he came across a guy named Ichabod Crane. Ichabod Crane really was a real person. Ichabod Crane was not a tall, gangly school teacher from New England, however. The Ichabod Crane that Washington Irving met was a rather robust and courageous colonel in the American Army during the War of 1812. Reportedly, the real Ichabod Crane was none too amused about his name being used to describe this cowardly schoolmaster. Nevertheless, he did kind of get everlasting fame out of it. Other names that Irving picked up from life, there is a Katrina van Tassel buried down in the old churchyard here. Her name is inscribed on a stone down there in Dutch, Katriana Ecker van Tassel. Irving lifts it, anglicizes it to Katrina van Tassel, and there you have the love interest. Irving has a fairly large family plot here. It's fairly common during the mid to late 1800s. We were founded in 1849, by the way, so we're the new kids on the block. Our neighbors, the old Dutch church, they date to colonial times. They're 325 years old. We're just a kid on the block. We're only 160 years. During our early years in the 1850s, it was common for people to buy a large family plot. These days we sell single and double graves, and future generations are on their own. Irving bought enough land here for multiple generations of his family. He himself didn't have descendants, but his siblings and their descendants made good use of this plot. So hence all the other gravestones in here. Now you'll notice that Irving's stone looks a little bit different from the others around it. His original gravestone looked identical to the ones on either side. He was such a popular figure at the time of his death that his legions of fans would come to visit him, not only during life, but after his death they would come visit him and pay their respects at his grave. And apparently some of them were souvenir hunters, and his first two, count them two, not one, his first two gravestones were chipped away as souvenirs by his loyal fans. We presume the family changed the shape of the last stone here, this third stone. It has rounded sides to it, doesn't have that corner to get that first chip off. We presume that they had that in mind when they put this stone in. Hard to get that first chip going. People do funny things in cemeteries, what can I say? All right, well, it was after Irving was right. After we changed our name to the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, we did start attracting folks that had some wealth and fame. There is a certain cachet to the name Sleepy Hollow. Some of the folks that would eventually come to be buried here in the cemetery, we can't visit them all tonight. We're too big to walk the entire grounds. Some of the famous folk that were lured here by Irving's story, Walter Chrysler started the Chrysler Corporation, is buried up in our far north end. Elizabeth Arden, the cosmetics mogul, she is buried here. Any New Yorkers in the crowd, you'll recognize Harry and Leona Helmsley, the real estate developers. They're in here. Brooke Astor, the philanthropist, she's here. Who else do we have? William Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Watson, founder of IBM. So we have a number of fairly wealthy and famous people that were found the name Sleepy Hollow appealing. So we have Mr. Irving to thank for that. Now we do have a lot of other people buried in here. We do have about 45,000 people buried in here, and a lot of the lesser known people are at least as interesting, if not more interesting, than the big names. So we will head out in just a moment here and visit some of those other folks that are up around the corner. When we do, can I borrow that for just a minute? Thanks. We're going to walk up this path over here. Let me lead the way. I'm just going to scoot through the crowd. There are about 7 or 8 stone steps up and then a dirt path. At the top of the path, give me just a moment, I'd like to lead the way up there. At the top of the path, there is a little storm drain. You don't want to turn your ankle in that. So I'm going to scoot on through the crowd there, and wherever I turn my ankle, don't step there. All right, everyone, this is the cemetery's receiving vault. Now, a receiving vault is simply a place where you can store bodies until they're ready for permanent burial. Now, in our early years, the reason why you might store bodies for a while is, well, the ground freezes in the winter, and you might have a crossland that you couldn't dig through to do in-ground burials during the colder months. So that was the reason we had a crypt here in our early years. These days we have a backhoe and we dig year-round. If we have to bring in really heavy-duty equipment, we do that too. So nothing stops us these days. We don't actually use this at the moment. People could use this during the winter when the ground was too, in our early years when the ground was too hard to dig through. Folks who weren't sure on what they wanted to do with their dearly departed family member could also have them reside in here until they figured out what they wanted to do. Sometimes people were building mausoleums on the property. William Rockefeller was up the top of the hill, spent about 1.5 years in here waiting for his mausoleum to be completed. So there are a number of reasons why it would be used. But when you have a receiving vault that doesn't get a lot of use for traditional cemetery purposes, you can find some interesting creative uses for them during the rest of the season. One thing we like to do is open it up for, well, we got a lot of school groups in here during the fall, so we have a couple of props in one of the open crypts there just for their entertainment. We go to the Halloween Superstore and pick up some leftovers. Note to self, should have gone 2 weeks ago, but oops, I better go soon. So we like to show some school groups. We also like to open up after dark because it's kind of fun to go in there after dark. Some other things you could do with receiving vaults when they're not being used for traditional cemetery purposes. Most of you guys are way too young to remember the 1960s television show Dark Shadows. But some of you have obviously heard of it. Now, Dark Shadows was a soap opera during the 60s. It had a decent following. It got a really good cult following when they introduced a vampire, a guy named Barnabas Collins. Now, the show did so well for itself that in 1970, the TV show producer did a feature-length film spin-off of Dark Shadows. He called it House of Dark Shadows, and he filmed that feature-length film at the Lyndhurst Estate in the south end of Tarrytown. When you have a vampire flick, you need a vampire's crypt. We happen to have one sitting here that, well, wasn't getting a lot of use. So in the 1970 vampire film, House of Dark Shadows, this is the crypt of the vampire Barnabas Collins. Should we go see if he's home? Yeah. Sure. The stuff in the crypt, you'll see a couple little friends in there, those are props. If there is anybody hanging from the ceiling, there may be a bat or two hanging from the ceiling. Those are real. Don't do anything to aggravate them so they stay hanging on the ceiling. This side, odd numbers on this side, just like a street address. I don't know where everyone's interred. Alright, those of you in the doorway, if you can step in a little bit, I think there are others that want to move on in. So, 42 crypts, no waiting. There aren't 42 of us. Yeah, we got a little critter up there.
Black dot.
Those of you that haven't seen the little bat there, that's it on the ceiling. Anyway, we are, those of you who are back here with me, we are actually underground.
See that?
That's our air shaft up there. You don't want people passing out in an underground crypt. Alright, well, it gets a little stuffy in here with all the lanterns, so I'm going to mosey on out. There we go. That bat's getting more attention now than it's seen in its lifetime. That bat's a star these days. Yeah, it gets nice and warm. By the way, if it's nice and warm, anyone wants to stay in here the rest of the trip, we'll come let you out later. I don't know, should we open it up? Yeah. The little thumb screws here. These unscrew, screw handles in, lift it up. Oh, that's why as far as we know, they're empty, but you know, the ground screw has keys too. Maybe we're in the side business. This is one of 3 military monuments on our grounds. There are no people buried under this one. Just a monument to folks who are buried elsewhere. This is a specifically a monument to veterans, local veterans of the American Revolution. Now, during the American Revolution, this was no man's land here in Westchester County. During the war, the British had their North American headquarters down in New York City. The Americans had an army up in Peekskill keeping an eye on the British. In between, you had people getting the squeeze. This was no man's land. Neither side actively controlled it. Both sides used it as their shopping cart. The British would send out raiding parties to this area, drive off people's cows, pigs, steal their grain. The Americans, of course, had an army to feed to our north, and they would do the same thing. So this was not really a pleasant place to be. The local militia companies were really your only hope for any sort of law and order, and the 70 people named on this monument are members of local militia companies. They would fight off raids by British foraging parties. They couldn't protect you against the whole British army, but they were really the only law and order in the area. A lot of them died not in battle. Some of them died in battle. A lot of them died on British prison ships, were captured and shipped down to Manhattan. The British maintained a series of prison ships off the eastern side of Manhattan Island, and when you went in there, you usually didn't come out. Contagious disease would rip through those ships, and you pretty much died of some contagious disease. So a lot of these folks really did serve their country, and not only served it, but laid down their lives for their country. They had no guarantee of what the country would be. They had no idea what we would become, so they really believed in what they were doing. Now, folks that are named here are largely buried down in our neighbor, the Old Dutch Church, and its 3-acre churchyard. In 1894, when this monument was erected by the villages of Tarrytown and North Tarrytown, the old churchyard was full. We had room up here in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, so we happily accepted it. And it's kind of an appropriate place for a Revolutionary War monument. The local militia companies actually used this particular area. They built a little earth redoubt here. You can see the remains of little earthworks behind me here. Sweeps around behind. There are crypts cut into it now. Sweeps around behind me and continues around this way, and the western side of it ends at what is today our receiving bowl. By the way, that's the roof of what we're just inside.
Oh, huh.
And you can also see how tall our deer are around here. That's the odd mushroom-shaped bush. That's our local white-tailed deer doing their work. Now, the local militia company had a little earth redoubt here. No active battles fought here. Kind of a little place where they could reconnoiter. Those of you who are on this side, you look through the trees, you see the lights of the Tappan Zee Bridge. If those trees weren't there, and during the Revolution they weren't because this was farmland, you would actually have a clear line of sight downriver. You can actually see Manhattan Island from, you can see the lights of Manhattan from just up the little rise here. So this was a good place for the local militia company to keep a little gathering point. You keep an eye on the water, see if the British were moving troops. You had a commanding view of the post road here. If the British were moving by land, you could keep an eye on British troop movements. Now, the militia company that built this little earth redoubt was led by a guy named Captain Daniel Delavan. He is buried immediately behind us, and some of you have been eyeing up his monument. It's that big one there. We're going to go pay a visit to Mr. Delavan next. Sure, let somebody said yes. I'm looking forward to it. Come on in, everyone. Lots of room in here. The Delavan family, Daniel Delavan, the captain of the local militia company that built that little earth redoubt, his name is on the right side of the monument, kind of out of sight to us. He fought the British not only during the American Revolution, he would go on to fight them again during the War of 1812, and during the War of 1812 he actually gained a field generalship, so he was buried as a general in the American Army. His son Charles would go on to make a fortune in the newly born country. His son Charles would go on to make a fortune in the hardware business. So when you make a fortune and you build a big fancy monument, you get to put your name on the front. Now the patriarch Daniel, Charles's father, died before we were founded here in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. He died in 1835. He was buried initially up in Sparta Cemetery in Ossining, a couple miles north of here. Once we were established, Charles thought it would be appropriate to bury his father down here in the remains of that old earth redoubt that his father had constructed. So kind of a nice touch for the old general. The signs and symbols you see around us here. Ooh, somebody's lighting up the inside of the mausoleum there. Cool. The symbols that you see in this section of the cemetery, largely Protestant and Catholic. We're non-denominational. We'll take anyone of any religion. The monuments you see here reflect the beliefs of the family. So in this case, we're pretty confident the Delavans are Christian. You have Jesus here front and center, designed the resurrection and the life around the base. You have angels around the perimeter of the plot. This one here holding a horn or some sort of a trumpet in her left hand, probably trumpet of the resurrection to blow on the last day to raise the dead. Angel over here, another female figure. Told you, ladies, you get a lot of coverage in the cemetery. Female figure here holding a garland of flowers, fairly recognizable during the time period as a symbol of eternal life. On the flashlight here, I'm just going to shine this over here. Another female angel holding a cross, obviously a Christian symbol. There is a guy in here. I promise there's a guy in here. In back out of sight. For most of you, there is a male angel also holding a garland of flowers, another symbol of eternal life. at the top of the monument, you've got another female figure leaning on an anchor. The combination of the female figure, she's not a grieving figure, by the way. She's looking hopefully off.